What would you do if a single moment could unravel your entire past? What if a stranger's shadow carried the weight of a heartbreak you thought was buried forever? What if a pair of weary amber eyes could stare straight into the deepest wound you've tried so hard to hide? Sometimes the smallest encounters can crack open a life you thought you'd pieced back together. This is the story of a woman who thought she was saving a lost soul, only to discover that soul had been sent to save her. In the quiet outskirts of Fayetteville, North Carolina, where the air hums with the distant rumble of Fort Bragg's training grounds and the sun dips low over pine-dotted hills, lived Sarah Bennett. She was a woman in her early 30s, with hands that trembled just a little too often and eyes that seemed to look right through you, searching for something or someone long gone. Sarah's small, weathered ranch house sat at the end of a gravel road, surrounded by sprawling fields that turned golden under the late afternoon sun. Inside, the walls were lined with faded photographs, some of her smiling beside a man in uniform, others of just her, standing alone with a forced grin. The air in her home smelled of old coffee and pine cleaner, a scent that clung to the silence like a stubborn memory. On the mantel, a folded American flag rested in a glass case, untouched but ever present, a silent reminder of a life she once had. Her nights were spent staring at that flag, her fingers tracing the edges of the case as if she could feel the fabric of a past she couldn't reclaim. Every now and then, her gaze would flicker to the empty space by the door where a pair of boots used to sit, waiting for their owner to come home. Sarah's days unfolded like a broken record, each one blending into the next with a heavy, predictable rhythm. She worked part-time at a local diner, the kind of place where truckers and veterans swapped stories over greasy plates of eggs and grits. She'd force a smile as she poured coffee, her apron stained with the day's spills, her voice steady but hollow as she asked, "How y'all doing today?" But behind the counter, her hands would fidget with a napkin, folding and unfolding it as if keeping busy could keep the memories at bay. She drove home in her beat-up Ford pickup, the radio tuned to a country station that played songs about love and loss, each lyric cutting a little deeper than the last. Back at the house, she'd sit on her sagging porch swing, watching the fireflies dance in the dusk, a glass of sweet tea in her hand, growing warm as she lost herself in thought. Neighbors would wave from across the field, shouting a friendly, "Hey, Sarah, you holding up okay?" And she'd nod, murmuring a quick, "Doing just fine," even though the words tasted like ash in her mouth. At night, sleep came in fits and starts, interrupted by dreams of desert sands and the distant echo of a voice calling her name. A voice she hadn't heard in over 3 years, since the day the chaplain knocked on her door with news that shattered her world. There was a quiet ache in Sarah's every move, a fragility she hid behind the mundane tasks of small-town life. She'd tend to her late husband's old garden out back, pulling weeds with a ferocity that bordered on desperate, as if she could uproot the grief that clung to her like ivy. She'd kneel in the dirt, her knees pressed into the earth, muttering to herself, "Just keep going, Sarah. One day at a time." But there were moments when the mask slipped, when she'd pass by a group of soldiers in town, their laughter ringing like a memory, and her breath would catch, her hands balling into fists at her sides. Or when she'd see a couple holding hands at the diner, and her chest would tighten, a wave of longing and anger crashing over her. She missed the life she'd planned, the lazy Sunday barbecues, the dream of little feet running through the house, the sound of his laugh filling the empty spaces. Now all she had were echoes, and a heart that refused to heal, no matter how many times she told herself, "I've got to move on." She volunteered at the local VA hospital once a week, sitting with veterans who reminded her too much of him, their stories of war and loss weaving into her own until she couldn't tell where their pain ended and hers began. Yet she kept showing up, as if being near their brokenness could somehow mend her own. It was on one of those grey, overcast Saturdays, when the sky hung low like a heavy curtain and the air carried the damp promise of rain, that Sarah's routine splintered in a way she never saw coming. She was driving home from the diner, her shift having ended with a spilled tray of sweet tea and a headache that throbbed behind her eyes. The road wound through the outskirts of town, past rusted barbed wire fences and fields where wildflowers clung stubbornly to life. Her truck's tires crunched over gravel as she slowed near a ditch, her eyes catching on something moving in the tall grass. At first, she thought it was just a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the swaying weeds. But then she saw it. A dog, thin as a whisper, its fur matted with mud and burrs, limping along the roadside. Its amber eyes caught hers through the windshield, and for a split second, time seemed to still. Those eyes weren't just tired, they were haunted, carrying a weight that felt eerily familiar, like looking into a mirror of her own grief. Sarah's foot hovered over the brake, her mind racing with reasons to keep driving. "I ain't got time for this," she muttered under her breath, but her heart tugged harder than her logic. She pulled over, stepping out into the damp air, her boots sinking into the soft earth as she approached the animal. The dog didn't run, didn't growl, just stood there trembling, its tail tucked between its legs as if it had forgotten how to hope. Up close, she could see the scars on its flank, the way its ribs pressed against its skin like the bars of a cage. A tattered collar hung loose around its neck, the leather worn and frayed, with no tag, no name, just a faded strip of camo fabric tied to it, a detail that made Sarah's breath hitch for reasons she couldn't yet name. She crouched down, her voice softening in a way it hadn't in years. "Hey buddy, you lost? Where'd you come from?" The dog tilted its head, letting out a low, mournful whine, and something in that sound cracked open a corner of Sarah's guarded heart. She reached out slowly, half expecting it to bolt, but instead it leaned into her touch, its cold nose brushing against her palm like a plea. Her eyes drifted back to that scrap of camo, and a chill ran down her spine, stirring a memory she couldn't quite grasp. It was tied to something, or someone, she'd lost, a ghost from a life before the flag on her mantle. Then, as her fingers brushed the collar, she noticed a faint engraving on the metal buckle, almost worn away by time and weather. She squinted, tilting it into the fading light, and her heart stopped cold. Etched into the metal were 3 letters, JTB, initials she knew better than her own. They belonged to her husband, James Thomas Bennett, the man who'd never come home from the sands of Afghanistan. Sarah's hand jerked back as if burned, her pulse hammering in her ears. She stared at the dog, then at the initials, then back again, her mind reeling with questions she wasn't ready to face. How could this be? James had never mentioned a dog, not in his letters, not in their late-night calls. But those letters on the collar, they weren't a coincidence. They couldn't be. The dog whined again, softer this time, its eyes locked on hers, as if it knew the storm breaking inside her. And in that moment, standing on the side of a lonely North Carolina road, with the weight of a past she'd tried to bury, Sarah felt something shift, a thread of connection, raw and fragile, pulling her toward a truth she wasn't sure she could handle. Sarah sat frozen in the damp grass by the roadside, her breath shallow, her hands shaking as she clutched the frayed collar in her palm. The dog's amber eyes watched her, unblinking, as if they could see straight through the walls she'd built around herself. JTB, those 3 letters carved into the metal buckle, felt like a blade slicing through years of numbness. Her mind spun, a storm of disbelief and raw, jagged pain tearing through her. How could this be? James had been gone for 3 years, his life snuffed out in a desert half a world away, leaving her with nothing but a folded flag and a hollowed-out heart. She'd buried him, or at least the memory of him, in every way she knew how. Pushing through empty days, avoiding the places they'd laughed together, pretending the ache didn't follow her like a shadow. And now, this. A dog, half-starved and broken, wearing a collar with his initials. It was impossible, irrational, and yet it felt like a cruel, deliberate echo of a wound that had never healed. Her fingers traced the letters again, as if touching them could summon answers, but all it did was drag up the weight of her grief, heavy and suffocating. "This ain't right," she whispered to herself, her voice cracking under the strain. "You're not supposed to be here. He's not supposed to be here." The dog tilted its head, letting out a soft, plaintive whine, and Sarah's chest tightened. She wanted to push it away, to get back in her truck and drive until the ache dulled again, but her legs wouldn't move. Guilt clawed at her. Guilt for even thinking of leaving this creature behind, for not knowing what James might have left behind in those final unspoken months. What if this dog was some piece of him, some part of his story she'd never been told? And worse, what if she wasn't strong enough to face whatever truth it carried? Her hands balled into fists, dirt caking under her nails as tears stung her eyes. She wasn't ready for this. She'd spent years building a fragile shell to hold herself together, and now, with one glance at those haunted eyes and those cursed initials, it was cracking apart. The air grew heavier as the first drops of rain began to fall, cold and sharp against her skin, but Sarah barely noticed. Her mind was elsewhere, trapped in the fog of memory. James's crooked smile as he waved from the porch before his last deployment, the way his letters had grown shorter, tenser toward the end, the chaplain's stiff, rehearsed words when he'd come to her door. "I'm sorry, ma'am." She'd replayed that moment 1,000 times, each one cutting deeper, but never once had there been a mention of a dog. Had James kept this from her? Had he carried some secret burden in those final days, something she'd failed to see? The thought gnawed at her, a bitter mix of anger and longing. "Why didn't you tell me?" she murmured, her voice barely audible over the rustle of the wind through the grass. The dog stepped closer, its muddy paws pressing into the earth near her boots, and nosed at her hand. She flinched, her breath hitching but didn't pull away. Those eyes, there was something in them, a quiet desperation that mirrored her own, and it scared her more than she could name. She forced herself to stand, her knees wobbling as she wiped her hands on her jeans, the collar still gripped tight in her fingers. "I can't just leave you here," she said, her voice thick with unshed tears. "But I don't know if I can handle this." The dog sat back on its haunches, waiting, as if it understood the war raging inside her. Sarah's gaze drifted to the horizon, where the sky was darkening over the pine-dotted hills, and for a moment she felt like she was standing on the edge of something far bigger than herself, a precipice between the life she'd been surviving and a truth she wasn't sure she could bear. She stuffed the collar into her jacket pocket, the weight of it pressing against her chest like a stone, and motioned for the dog to follow her to the truck. It limped after her, slow and unsteady, but determined, each step a small act of trust that made her throat tighten. As she opened the passenger door and helped it clamber onto the worn seat, she caught her reflection in the window, pale, hollowed out, a woman haunted by ghosts she couldn't outrun. She slammed the door harder than she meant to, the sound echoing in the quiet, and muttered under her breath, "What am I even doing?" The drive back to her ranch house was silent, save for the patter of rain against the windshield and the dog's ragged breathing beside her. Sarah kept her eyes on the road, but her mind was a tangle of questions and fears. Every few seconds she'd glance at the dog, its head resting on its paws, staring out at the passing fields with an expression she couldn't read. What if this was some kind of mistake? What if those initials meant something else? Someone else? But even as she tried to rationalize it, her gut twisted with the certainty that this wasn't random. The camo strip tied to the collar, the faded scars on the dog's flank, it all pointed to a life tied to war, to James, to a past she'd never fully understood. Her hands tightened on the steering wheel, knuckles white, as a wave of anger surged through her. She was mad at James for leaving her to face this alone, mad at herself for not asking more questions when she'd had the chance, mad at the universe for dragging this piece of him back into her life when she was barely holding on as it was. When she pulled into the gravel drive of her house, the rain had picked up, drumming against the truck's roof like a heartbeat. The old ranch house loomed ahead, its sagging porch swing creaking in the wind, a lonely sentinel against the grey sky. Sarah cut the engine and sat there for a long moment, staring at the folded flag, visible through the living room window. It had been her anchor and her curse, a reminder of duty and loss, and now it felt like a challenge. "I don't know what you want from me," she said softly, not sure if she was speaking to the dog, to James, or to the empty space where her life used to be. The dog lifted its head, letting out a low huff, and pawed at the seat, as if urging her to keep going. She sighed, rubbing a hand over her face, and finally stepped out into the downpour, helping the dog down to the muddy ground. Together, they trudged toward the house, each step heavier than the last, the weight of unanswered questions pressing down on her like the rain-soaked earth. Inside, the air was stale, the silence broken only by the drip of water from their soaked clothes. Sarah knelt to peel off her boots, her movements mechanical, but her eyes kept darting to the dog as it stood near the door, trembling and uncertain. She grabbed an old towel from the hall closet, the scent of dust and faded laundry detergent clinging to it, and crouched beside the animal, gently wiping the mud from its fur. "You don't belong here," she muttered, her voice rough with emotion. "But neither do I, not anymore." The dog leaned into her touch, its warmth a stark contrast to the coldness she'd wrapped herself in for so long, and for a fleeting second she felt a flicker of something. Connection, maybe, or the ghost of hope. But it was quickly smothered by the ache in her chest. She stood abruptly, tossing the towel aside, and turned toward the mantel where the flag sat in its glass case. The dog followed, its claws clicking softly against the hardwood, and sat at her feet, staring up at the case as if it understood. Sarah's fingers hovered over the glass, not quite touching it, as memories crashed over her. James's last letter, scribbled in a hurried hand, promising he'd be home soon, the way he'd hummed under his breath while working in the garden out back, the moment she'd folded into herself when they told her he was gone. "Did you know him?" she asked, her voice breaking as she looked down at the dog. "Were you there when I couldn't be?" The dog blinked up at her, its amber eyes steady, and the silence that followed was louder than any answer. She sank to her knees, her hands covering her face as the tears she'd held back for so long finally spilled over. She cried for James, for the life they'd lost, for the pieces of him she'd never know, and for the dog that carried a burden she couldn't yet comprehend. It nudged her arm, resting its head against her shoulder, and she let it stay there, the warmth of its presence both a comfort and a knife. The next morning, the rain had stopped, leaving behind a world washed clean but still heavy with dampness. Sarah hadn't slept, her mind too tangled to rest, and she sat at the kitchen table with a mug of cold coffee, the dog curled up on an old blanket by her feet. The collar lay on the table in front of her, those initials glaring back like an accusation. She'd spent half the night turning it over in her mind, trying to piece together a story that made sense, but nothing did. Finally, she reached for her phone, her thumb hesitating over the screen before dialing a number she hadn't called in months. "Hey, Tom," she said when the other line picked up, her voice tight. Tom was an old friend of James's, a fellow soldier who'd come back when James hadn't, and the only person she could think to ask. "I need a favor. Can you look into something for me?" Tom's voice was gravelly, laced with the weariness of someone who'd seen too much. "Sarah, it's been a while. You okay?" She swallowed hard, her eyes flicking to the dog, who'd lifted its head at the sound of her voice. "I don't know," she admitted. "I found a dog. It's got a collar with James's initials on it. I need to know if he had one over there." if there's anything I didn't know." There was a long pause on the other end, the kind that told her Tom was weighing his words carefully. "I'll see what I can dig up," he said finally. "But Sarah, you sure you want to go down this road? Some things, they're better left alone." Her jaw tightened, a surge of frustration bubbling up. "I ain't got a choice, Tom. It's already here, staring me in the face." She hung up before he could argue, her hands trembling as she set the phone down. The waiting was torture. Over the next few days, Sarah threw herself into routine, trying to keep the storm at bay, but it was impossible. She took the dog to the vet, who confirmed it was malnourished and scarred but otherwise healthy, and guessed it was some kind of shepherd mix, likely trained for something more than companionship. "Looks like he's been through hell," the vet said, his tone casual but cutting. Sarah nodded, her throat tight, unable to voice the parallel that burned in her mind. She named the dog Buddy, a placeholder more than anything, though every time she said it, it felt like a betrayal of something she couldn't name. Buddy followed her everywhere, a quiet shadow that both soothed and unsettled her. At night, he'd curl up by the door, near the empty spot where James's boots used to sit, and Sarah would watch him from the couch, her heart twisting with a mix of tenderness and dread. She drove to the VA hospital for her weekly volunteer shift, Buddy riding shotgun in the truck, his head resting on the window ledge as the countryside rolled by. The hospital sat on the edge of Fayetteville, a grey sprawl of buildings near Fort Bragg, where the sound of helicopters and artillery drills echoed in the distance, a constant reminder of the life she'd lost. Inside, the halls smelled of antiseptic and regret, and the veterans she sat with carried the same haunted look she saw in Buddy's eyes. One man, a grizzled vet named Carl with a prosthetic leg, noticed the dog tied up outside and asked about him. "He yours?" Carl grunted, peering out the window. Sarah hesitated, her hands fidgeting with a styrofoam coffee cup. "For now," she said, her voice flat. Carl studied her for a moment, his gaze sharp, despite the pain etched into his face. "Looks like he's got a story. You ever think maybe he's carrying something you're meant to figure out?" She forced a shrug, the words hitting too close. "Maybe. Don't know if I want to know." That night back at the house, Tom called. His voice was heavy, the kind of tone that warned her before he even spoke. "Sarah, I got something. James. He did have a dog over there, a stray he took in during his last tour. Used it as a kind of unofficial support animal, helped him and the guys cope with the stress. He didn't mention it in letters because he didn't want you worrying about one more thing. But there's more." Sarah's heart pounded, her grip on the phone tightening. "What kind of more?" she asked, dreading the answer. Tom sighed, the sound crackling through the line. "The dog was with him on that last mission. The one where we lost him. Some of the guys saw it run off after the blast. Never thought it'd make it back stateside, though. I don't know how, but if that's the same dog, it's been through as much as you have. Maybe more." The words landed like a punch, stealing her breath. Sarah sank into a chair, her eyes locking on Buddy, who was watching her from across the room. With James when he died. The thought looped in her mind, each repetition sharper, more unbearable. She saw it now, in the scars, in the haunted stare. Buddy wasn't just a stray. He was a witness to the moment that had shattered her world. "Thanks, Tom," she managed, her voice barely a whisper before she hung up. She sat there for a long time, the silence of the house pressing in, broken only by the faint tick of the clock on the wall. Buddy padded over, resting his head on her knee, and she stared down at him, tears blurring her vision. "You saw it, didn't you?" she choked out. "You saw him go." The dog let out a soft whine, as if confirming her worst fear, and she buried her face in her hands, the weight of shared loss crushing her. The days that followed were a blur of raw emotion. Sarah couldn't look at Buddy without seeing James's final moments, without imagining the chaos and the dust and the pain etched into the dog's memory. She found an old box of James's things in the attic, untouched since the day she'd packed it away, and pulled out a stack of letters. Some she'd read, some she hadn't been able to face. Her fingers trembled as she unfolded one near the end of his tour. The paper yellowed and creased. "I found a friend out here," he'd written, his handwriting shaky. "He's got no name yet, just a mutt who won't leave me alone. Keeps me grounded when things get dark. Wish I could tell you more, darling, but I don't want to weigh you down. I'll be home soon." Sarah's breath caught, a sob tearing from her throat. He'd wanted to protect her, even from this small truth, and now that protection felt like a betrayal. She clutched the letter to her chest, Buddy lying at her feet, and for the first time in years, she let herself feel the full force of her anger at James, at the war, at a world that had taken so much and given her only fragments to piece back together. But there was something else in the box. Tucked between the letters, a small, worn photograph of James in his uniform, crouched in the desert sand, a dog at his side. Buddy. Even through the faded image, she could see the bond, the way James's hand rested on the dog's head, a rare softness in his face. Sarah stared at it, her heart breaking all over again, but this time with a flicker of understanding. Buddy wasn't just a reminder of loss. He was a piece of James that had survived, that had fought to find its way back. She looked at the dog, sleeping now on the rug, and felt the weight of a decision pressing down on her. Could she keep him, knowing what he represented? Could she carry the shared grief, the unspoken memories without breaking under them? Or would letting him go be the final severance of the past she'd been too afraid to release? The tipping point came late one evening as Sarah sat on the porch swing, the air cool and thick with the scent of pine. Buddy lay beside her, his head on his paws, watching the fireflies blink in the dusk. She'd spent hours wrestling with her choices, each one more impossible than the last. Her phone buzzed with a text from Tom. "If you need help rehoming him, I know folks at the base who'd take him in. Just say the word." The word stung, a cold reminder of how easy it could be to walk away, to close this chapter for good. But as she looked at Buddy, at the way his scarred flank rose and fell with each breath, she felt something shift inside her, a fierce, aching need to protect what was left of James's story, even if it hurt. She stood, her resolve hardening, and walked back inside, grabbing the collar from the kitchen table. Her fingers brushed over the initials one last time before she knelt beside Buddy, carefully slipping it back around his neck. "I ain't letting you go," she said, her voice steady for the first time in days, though it trembled at the edges. "He'd want me to take care of you. And maybe you're here to take care of me too." Buddy lifted his head, his amber eyes meeting hers, and for a moment she swore she saw something like relief, like recognition. She sat back on her heels, tears streaming down her face. But this time, they weren't just grief. They were a release, a promise. She was choosing to carry this weight, to face whatever truths lay ahead, because letting go of Buddy would mean letting go of the last piece of James she could still touch. And as she sat there, the weight of that decision settling over her like a mantle, she felt the first stirrings of something she hadn't felt in years, purpose. But the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There were still questions unanswered, scars unhealed, and a past that refused to stay buried. If you're as invested in Sarah and Buddy's journey as I am, hit that subscribe button right now. Don't miss the next part of this story, because what comes next will test every ounce of strength they have left, and the truth they uncover might just change everything. The rain had barely stopped the next morning, leaving the world outside Sarah's ranch house drenched and heavy with the scent of wet earth. Her decision to keep Buddy, to hold onto this aching piece of James, sat in her chest like a stone, solid, unmovable, but sharp-edged. She stood at the kitchen window, a mug of untouched coffee in her hands, staring out at the muddy fields where the first slivers of sunlight broke through the grey. Buddy lay on the old blanket by the door, his amber eyes half closed but watchful, as if he sensed the storm still brewing inside her. She'd made her choice last night, slipping that worn collar back around his neck, whispering words of commitment through tears. But now, in the cold light of day, the weight of it pressed down harder than ever. What did it mean to keep him? To carry not just her own grief, but his, the unspoken memories of a day she could only imagine through shards of pain. Her fingers tightened around the mug, the porcelain warm against her calloused palms, and she muttered under her breath, "I don't even know where to start." The first few hours after her decision felt like walking through fog, everything familiar, yet distorted by the new reality she'd chosen. She moved through her morning routine with a mechanical precision, her hands shaking as she poured kibble into an old bowl for Buddy. He ate slowly, his scarred flank twitching with each cautious bite, and Sarah watched him with a knot in her stomach. Every glance at him brought a flash of James, his crooked smile, the way he'd scrawl hurried letters under lantern light, the silence that followed when he didn't come home. She wanted to ask Buddy questions she knew he couldn't answer. What did you see? Were you with him when it happened? Did he say anything at all before the end? The not knowing gnawed at her, a relentless ache that grew with every quiet moment. She dropped the empty bag of kibble on the counter with a thud, the sound jarring in the stillness, and pressed her hands to her face. "I can't keep doing this," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she meant carrying the questions or letting them go. Tension coiled tighter as the day wore on. Sarah took Buddy outside, her boots sinking into the soggy ground as she trudged to the garden out back, the one James had loved, the one she'd kept up out of duty more than joy. She knelt in the dirt, yanking weeds with a ferocity that mirrored the chaos in her mind, while Buddy sat nearby, his head tilted as if studying her. The air was thick with the smell of damp soil and pine, and every rustle of leaves sounded like a whisper from the past, taunting her with half-formed memories. Her hands paused over a stubborn root, her breath hitching as a wave of anger surged through her. Anger at James for keeping Buddy a secret, for leaving her to face this alone. Anger at herself for not being enough to hold on to him, even in memory. And anger at Buddy, irrational as it was, for carrying a piece of that day she could never touch. "Why'd you have to show up now?" she snapped, her voice breaking as she glared at the dog. He didn't flinch, just blinked up at her with those haunted eyes, and the silence between them felt heavier than any words. She rocked back on her heels, wiping sweat and tears from her face with the back of her hand, her chest tight with a scream she couldn't release. By afternoon, the strain had stretched her nerves to their breaking point. She sat on the porch swing, the old chains creaking under her weight, while Buddy lay at her feet, his breathing a quiet rhythm against the distant hum of Fort Bragg's drills. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, Tom again checking in, offering once more to help rehome the dog if she couldn't handle it. She stared at the screen, her thumb hovering over the reply, every muscle in her body taut with the temptation to say yes, to let go, to close this door before it shattered her completely. Her gaze drifted to the folded flag inside, visible through the cracked window, and then to Buddy, whose scarred flank bore the marks of a war she'd only lived through in nightmares. "I made a promise," she muttered to herself, though the words felt hollow, like a prayer she didn't fully believe in. The swing swayed as she gripped the armrest, her knuckles white, the weight of her choice pressing down until it felt like she couldn't breathe. What if she wasn't strong enough? What if keeping Buddy meant drowning in a grief she'd barely survived the first time? The breaking point came that evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and gold. Sarah sat on the living room floor, the box of James's things open before her like a wound laid bare. Letters, photographs, a torn piece of uniform fabric. She'd pulled them out one by one, each item a shard of a life she couldn't reclaim. Buddy lay nearby, his head resting on his paws, watching her with a stillness that felt almost human. Her fingers trembled as she unfolded the last letter, the one she'd read 100 times but never fully felt until now. "I'll be home soon, darling," James had written, his handwriting shaky from exhaustion or fear or both. "Keep the porch light on for me." She'd kept it on for months after he was gone, a foolish hope that burned out long before the bulb did. Now, holding those words, she felt the dam inside her crack. "You didn't come back," she choked out, her voice raw, aimed at the empty air, at the ghost she'd carried for 3 years. "You left me here, and now I've got him, and I don't know what to do with any of it." Buddy lifted his head at the sound of her sob, padding over with a limp that tugged at her heart. He nudged her hand, his cold nose pressing against her palm, and something in that simple touch shattered the last of her restraint. She dropped the letter, pulling him close, her arms wrapping around his thin frame as tears poured out. Tears for James, for the future they'd lost, for the dog who'd seen it all and still chose to stay. "I'm sorry," she whispered into his fur, her voice muffled but fierce. "I'm sorry I didn't know. I'm sorry I wasn't there for either of you." It was a confession, a plea, a release of the guilt she'd buried under layers of survival. Buddy let out a low whine, resting his head against her shoulder, and in that moment it felt like he understood, like he forgave her for the things she couldn't change. They sat there, locked in a shared silence, as the ache of loss and the warmth of connection battled within her, until finally the storm began to ease. Something shifted in Sarah after that night, a quiet transformation that took root in the rawness of her honesty. The next morning she woke with a clarity she hadn't felt in years, though it came with a tender, lingering pain. She moved through her routine with purpose now, not just survival. She cleaned out the garden with gentler hands, planting new seeds in the earth James had once tended, as if to promise him, and herself, that life could still grow from ashes. Buddy followed her everywhere, no longer just a shadow but a partner, his presence a steady anchor when the memories threatened to pull her under. She started taking him to the VA hospital during her volunteer shifts, watching as the veterans' faces softened at the sight of him, their hands reaching out to stroke his fur as they shared stories of their own losses. One old soldier, Carl, looked at Buddy with knowing eyes and said, "He's a fighter, like you. Don't let go of that." Sarah nodded, a small, genuine smile breaking through for the first time in months, and felt the truth of it settle into her bones. Her nights changed too. Instead of staring at the folded flag on the mantel with a hollow ache, she began to speak to it. Soft words, sometimes angry, sometimes loving, as if James could hear her through the years and miles. "I've got Buddy now," she said one evening, her voice steady as she sat on the couch with the dog at her feet. "I think you'd be proud of us, even if we're still figuring it out." It wasn't closure, not fully, but it was a step, a bridge between the woman she'd been and the one she was becoming. And in that bridge, there was a sacrifice, subtle but profound. She took down the glass case around the flag, her hands trembling as she set it aside, choosing to let the fabric breathe, to let it exist without the barrier she'd built around her grief. It was a renunciation of the walls she'd clung to, a symbolic offering to the life she still had to live. The flag stayed on the mantel, but now it felt less like a tombstone and more like a quiet companion, resting beside her as she rebuilt. Weeks passed, and the bond between Sarah and Buddy deepened into something unbreakable, forged in shared scars and silent understanding. One crisp evening, as autumn painted the fields in shades of amber and crimson, Sarah walked out to the edge of her property, where a small wooden cross marked the spot she'd chosen to honor James after his ashes had been scattered. She carried the collar, the one with JTB etched into the buckle, its leather worn softer now from her constant touch. Buddy trotted beside her, his limp less pronounced with each day of care, his amber eyes catching the last light of the setting sun. When they reached the cross, Sarah knelt, her knees pressing into the cool earth, and placed the collar at its base, her fingers lingering on the initials one last time. It wasn't a goodbye to James, but a promise to remember, to carry forward, to let love grow even in the shadow of loss. Buddy sat beside her, his warmth a quiet comfort, as the wind whispered through the pines, carrying with it the weight of time and the possibility of healing. As she stood brushing the dirt from her hands, Sarah looked out over the rolling hills, where the sky seemed to hold both the past and the future in its vast embrace. She thought about war, about the way it steals and scars and silences, but also about the stubborn human heart, how it fights to mend, to find light, to re-begin even when the odds are stacked against it. Grief, she realized, wasn't a thing to conquer, but a thing to hold, to walk with until its edges softened under the weight of new days. And in that understanding, there was hope. Not loud or certain, but quiet, persistent, like the first green shoots after a long winter. If this story of Sarah and Buddy has tugged at your heart, if it's reminded you of the power of holding on through the pain, I'd love to hear from you. Comment below with, "I believe in healing," if you felt their journey resonate with your own. Share this with someone who needs a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there's a chance to start again. And if you want to keep following stories that reach deep into the soul, hit that subscribe button now. Let's walk this path of hope together.